So currently in Canada, we're sitting at about 76 unique herbicide-resistant weed biotypes. And that kind of puts us, I guess, in third place as far as the most number of herbicide-resistant weed biotypes behind Australia and the United States.
Hi, and welcome to the Farming Smarter podcast. These podcasts are brought to you in part by Farming Smarter, the Lethbridge College, and the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, a joint federal and provincial government initiative for agriculture. Your host today is me, Mike Gretzinger, the research coordinator at Farming Smarter, and I'm joined today by Dr. Charles Geddes, a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada based out of Lethbridge, Alberta. He leads the Weed Ecology and Cropping Systems Research Program, which focuses on discovery, monitoring, and management of herbicide-resistant weeds in Western Canada. Charles grew up on a mixed cattle farm near Pilot Mound, Manitoba. He graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Agroecology and a PhD in Plant Science with specialization in weed science from the University of Manitoba. Dr. Geddes has a special interest in novel herbicide-resistant traits. He currently leads prairie-wide research projects focused on management of glyphosate-resistant Kosha, weed seed bank management, integrated weed management in soybean, and development of revitalized long-term agroecosystem experiment within the AAFC. His areas of interest include herbicide-resistant plants, plant ecology, weed seed banks, agroecology, and long-term experiments. Welcome, Charles Geddes.
Well, thank you very much. My pleasure.
Okay. So I wanted to start, I noticed you grew up on a farm and then you became a farm researcher. So tell us a little bit about growing up on the farm and how you got involved in agricultural research.
For sure, yeah. So growing up on a farm, basically, the farm was in southern Manitoba. The farm mainly focused on cattle production and forage production. We also did some grain as well. And it kind of, my interest, first of all, in weeds, I guess, started on the farm, right? Of course, as a typical farm kid, a lot of the summer is spent pulling weeds on the farm, right? So it kind of started thinking, there's got to be a better way.
Absolutely.
But really, my interest in weed science kind of grew when I started farming with my parents, right? So we were doing some grain farming and we took over a rented quarter section that my dad and I were farming together, and basically we didn't really know what problems came along with that, right? And one of the big issues that we ran into was herbicide-resistant wild oats.
Okay.
And basically, that's kind of where my interest in weed science kind of started, and my interest in herbicide resistance.
So they pushed you maybe to pursue academics rather than stay on the farm?
They did, I think.
Yeah.
They were very open to either one.
Okay.
My plan throughout university was actually to return to the farm. And then that changed a little bit as we got farther and farther into academia and just different studies, right? So
yeah, well, I'm glad you stuck around. We're really happy. I think you said 2.5 years at Agriculture Agri-Food Canada now? Yeah,
that's right. So I moved out to the Lethbridge area in the summer of 2017 and took over a research program that was quite well equipped to do field research, and the research that we're doing has kind of exploded over the last couple of years, so we're quite busy.
Oh, that's really great. So we're going to hear a bit more about that research later. We're going to talk a lot about weeds and weed resistance, though, today. And so I wanted to start with maybe some really simple definitions and some concepts just to make sure, because there's things I know I struggle with and I should know. And, kind of when they go around and do those funny TV shows and, they quiz people on the street and they ask them, what's a GMO or something? And nobody can really give you a definition. And I feel like even within our ag community, a lot of people maybe struggle with weed resistance and what it is and how it works. So we'll talk a little bit about that first, I think. So one funny thing I want to ask you is just kind of like, what do you consider a weed? What's the definition of a weed for you?
Sure, yeah. So there's been a lot of definitions of what is a weed, right? In general, they all get back to the concept that a weed is essentially a plant that is out of place, right? So it's all open to your specific interpretation, right? Do you want that plant to be there? And if you don't, then it is considered a weed. Doesn't really matter on the species.
I like that. That's actually probably the definition, the first one that I heard that really resonated with me. So I like that, a plant at a place. And ironically, a lot of the weeds we have here in the prairies right now probably started as somebody's beautiful ornamental plant from Europe.
Of course, yeah. There are a lot of weeds that we deal with in our cropping systems that were introduced as an ornamental at one point in time.
And so that's a little bit different maybe than what the problem we have with some of the weeds now, which is moving into weed resistance. So can you explain what exactly that means by herbicide resistance in weeds?
Sure, yeah. So the definition of herbicide resistance in general, this might not be the exact wording, but it's basically the ability for a plant to survive and reproduce following treatment with a dose of a herbicide that would normally be lethal to a wild type plant of the same species, right? So, and what we mean by wild type is basically how that plant would be naturally in the environment, right? So, so resistance is something that is a result of a selection pressure forcing that population to evolve resistance to the herbicide. So if you compare that to herbicide tolerance, which is different. So herbicide tolerance is the ability for a plant to survive a herbicide application in general, right? So it's not the result of a selection pressure. It's just that particular weed species is naturally tolerant to that herbicide in the environment.
So to maybe clear up some misconceptions, then there's a non-lethal dose that you could apply to a certain weed, and that wouldn't kill it, but at the lethal dose it would. That's not the same thing when we're talking about herbicide resistance.
No, so that's not the same thing. So all herbicides have a certain rate that we would be using them at in our cropping systems, and those rates can vary depending on the crop sensitivity as well, right? But in general, those rates are set to be a lethal dose for the weed species that they're targeting, right? But if you are applying rates that are sublethal or below the labeled rate, and the weed's not controlled, it's certainly not considered resistant.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's maybe a common misconception that I hear about, that applying a non-lethal dose is something that causes the resistance. And what we're saying is that the herbicide resistance is just a natural thing that happens. There's a genetic mutation or ability of enzymes to change and adapt, and therefore those weeds are no longer controlled. And after a certain number of cycles or life cycles for those weeds, they just become resistant and that population spreads.
Right. So there are different ways that herbicide resistance can evolve, right? So just touching back on non-lethal doses, right? So that actually is a way that herbicide resistance can evolve.
Okay.
But if you are applying below the labeled rate and it's not controlled, that's not considered resistant, right? But over time, if you're applying sublethal doses, you can select for a certain type of resistance. So as far as herbicide resistance is concerned, there's different types of resistance, right? Or different mechanisms of resistance. So in general, those are organized into a couple different categories. The first is target site resistance, and the second is non-target site resistance. So target site resistance is basically, it gets back to herbicide activity. So when a herbicide enters the plant, right, it binds to an enzyme target site, right? And when it binds to the target site, it is inhibiting or reducing the activity of that enzyme, or the ability, or the ability for that plant to have a certain metabolic function, right? So when the herbicide binds to a target site, it's inhibiting something to do with either plant metabolism or physiology, right?
Okay.
So target site resistance results from a random and natural mutation in a weed, right? So these mutations happen at random. They're very rare, But every so often you'll have a weed that has this mutation that confers a target site resistance, which basically reduces the ability for the herbicide to bind to the target site and have its activity.
Okay.
So that's target site resistance. But if you look at non-target site resistance, there's several different mechanisms of non-target site resistance, and one of the main ones is metabolic resistance. And so getting back to these sublethal doses, metabolic resistance is a type of resistance that can be selected for by repetitive application of herbicide at sublethal doses. So essentially, the way metabolic resistance works is when the herbicide enters the plant, the plants, they basically start to detoxify the active ingredients in the herbicide, right? So metabolic resistance is basically a selection over time, or a building in that population towards plants in that species that have a higher and higher rate of metabolism for that herbicide, right? So it's breaking down the herbicide before it even reaches the target site.
Oh, that's very cool. Yeah, so the first is kind of equivalent. We all have different mutations. You might have one blue eye, one brown, something. These things randomly happen within our bodies, within plant cells, things like that. And the second is more that kind of environmental factors where we just kind of, only the strong survive type resistance. Is that kind of some basic summary of how that works?
Exactly.
Okay.
So often for target site resistance, it's a very low proportion of the individuals in the population have the mutation, and repeated use of a herbicide at a lethal rate will basically allow for only those with the resistant mutation to survive and reproduce, right? And those plants add seed to the seed bank, and slowly you'll see a shift over to more and more resistant individuals in the population.
Okay.
Whereas metabolic resistance can be selected for in multiple individuals at once, right? But you're just selecting for those individuals that have a higher and higher rate of metabolism.
Okay, so I think we're clear on that then, and hopefully everybody listening is as well. Maybe we'll go on to maybe just look at if there's anything else that causes resistance, or any other factors, or is it just really related to these two mechanisms?
Yeah, so there's first of all, there are other mechanisms of herbicide resistance, right? But those two, basically metabolic resistance and target site resistance, are very large problems right now. But as far as other things that cause resistance, so a lot of it has to do with first of all, the herbicide, but then second of all, the biology of the plant, right? So herbicides have a different selection pressure, and that can be related to the efficacy of the herbicide. But also, when we're looking at weed biology, it can also be related to how many possible viable mutations could actually confer that type of resistance in a plant, right? So, for example, we'll talk about the group 1 and 2 herbicides. So group 1s are basically your selective graminicides, so something that you would be using to manage a grassy weed in a grass crop. And then group 2s also, a popular use would be for wild oat management. So those two herbicides kind of comprise most of our post-emergence options for wild oat management, and wild oats are obviously one of the largest problems on the prairies. So those two groups of herbicides have a greater selection pressure for resistance, and the main reason being that there are several mutations that can occur in a plant that confer resistance to those herbicides, compared to some of the other modes of action where there are not as many viable mutations. So that is one thing, but then also there are several other factors like the genetic diversity within the species, the rate of outcrossing within the species, as well as how much, or what we would call fecundity, or the amount of seed that a plant produces, right? So an example being Kosha, it can select for resistance very quickly, and one of the main reasons is because it can produce 30,000 seeds per plant or more, right?
Absolutely.
And another thing that I would mention is the persistence of seed in the seed bank. So we generally think of, obviously, long-term persistence being a problem with weeds, but actually when we're talking about herbicide resistance, it's a short-lived seed bank that can be a problem, because you can select for a resistant individual in 1 year, and then those individuals will ultimately emerge the following year if it has short-lived seed bank persistence or low seed dormancy, right? So you can see a rapid selection for resistance quite quickly.
All right. Well, you got me all worried and worked up about weed resistance now. How big of a problem is this across southern Alberta and Western Canada in general compared to, say, places like Australia? And how have all these factors and scenarios played into, the growing problem of herbicide resistance or weed resistance?
Right. Yeah. So that's a big question. In general, when we're talking about herbicide-resistant biotypes, we usually talk about unique herbicide-resistant weed biotypes, and what we refer to there is a weed species that's resistant to a herbicide mode of action, right? So currently in Canada, we're sitting at about 76 unique herbicide-resistant weed biotypes, and that kind of puts us, I guess, in third place as far as the most number of herbicide-resistant weed biotypes behind Australia and the United States. So as far as herbicide resistance on the prairies is concerned, we do see resistance increasing. So basically, one of the new projects that I'm just taking over the leadership of is the Prairie Herbicide Resistant Weed Surveys. And these surveys document resistance in over 20 species across the prairies over time. So these surveys have been conducted using the same methods since 2000. And what we can do with that is look at if the resistance in a particular species is increasing and by what amount, right? So those surveys in general have shown that resistance in the prairies is increasing. We're sitting at a point now where basically 50% of the fields have a herbicide-resistant weed biotype in the prairies. So obviously that creates problems for growers when they come to manage weeds. And
we know that those are commonly wild oats, not necessarily cleavers in the Lethbridge area, but other parts of the Western Canada.
Yep.
And Kosha, which is kind of your area of expertise.
Yeah. So I mean, those three species are particularly problematic, right? Wild oats is by far the most widespread and one of the most difficult problems to manage on the prairies currently. So for wild oats, we have resistance to group 1 herbicides as well as group 2 herbicides, right? And we also have documented resistance to group 8 or soil applied herbicides as well. So right now on the prairies, we're sitting at a point where we see resistance to group 1 and 2 herbicides in about a quarter of the fields on the prairies where wild oat is sampled.
Okay, and what about Kosha?
So Kosha is particularly problematic on the southern part of the prairies, right? So not as abundant as you move farther northward, right? But in certainly in the southern part of the prairies, like the grassland ecoregion, for example, Kosha is the most abundant weed, and in part that's due to herbicide resistance. So in Kosha we have resistance now to group 2 herbicides. So to the point where we consider all Kosha populations in Western Canada resistant to group 2 herbicides now. And we're starting to see the same thing with glyphosate resistance as well, which is a group 9 herbicide, right? So glyphosate resistance in Kosha was found in 2011 and in just south of Lethbridge here in southern Alberta. And over the course of basically the last almost decade, we're at a point where glyphosate resistance is now in about half of the populations that we test. So our recent surveys from Alberta show about 50% of the populations tested in 2017 were glyphosate resistant, And then some of our more recent results from Manitoba have shown about 59% of the populations in Manitoba are glyphosate resistant as well. And currently, we're working with researchers from Ag Canada in Saskatoon on the Saskatchewan survey, but I suspect it'll show very similar results.
Okay. So, I mean, it's a little bit all doom and gloom, but this has been happening for a number of years. And like we said, at least we're only in third worst place right now. But really, herbicide resistance has been because of some of the changes in our cropping systems. We had a big change happened with reduced tillage in southern Alberta here in the early 90s, and a shift towards herbicide-resistant crops. And, I think there's probably been a lot of positive environmental stories, and this is probably just one of the things that is kind of a negative consequence of all the other good news work that's happened in agriculture. So obviously we're well aware of the problem, and what are some of the things that we're doing to make things better in this regard?
Yeah, so I mean, there's weed populations, they will respond to whatever tool you use for weed management, right? It just so happens that our most commonly used tools are chemicals, right? So we're starting to see resistance to those chemicals, right? But this is why we integrate we suggest an integrated weed management approach, right? Which essentially is using multiple different tools for weed management. So what I mean by that is using, you can use chemicals, but also using non-chemical tools, which would fall into a few different categories. So those categories are cultural weed management, which is more of a preventative way to manage weeds, or to try and promote the ability for the crop to compete with weeds and reduce weed seed production. So some examples being like increased seeding rates, reduced row spacing, crop rotation, right? So planning your weed management program beforehand.
Yeah, and I've seen some really neat examples of that, like right out in the field, just the difference between, say 200 seeds per meter squared of wheat versus 400 seeds per meter squared, and you almost don't even need an in-crop herbicide with the high seeding rate, and you can see visually really obviously how big of a difference some of those management practices are.
Yeah, for sure. Like some of our research on Kosha, so we're looking at we're looking at crop rotation first of all, but we're also integrating some of the rotation in herbicide chemistries that comes along with that. But in addition, looking at these cultural tools, specifically one experiment looking at the combination of row spacing and seeding rate, right?
Yeah, I think the row spacing and seeding rate is it's not that it's obvious, but I mean, if you narrow up your rows and crank the seeding rate, more than likely you're going to outcompete the weeds, and there's probably a sweet spot in there, I imagine, for different crops and things like that.
Yeah.
I'm pretty curious about the rotational stuff. I haven't heard much about that, and I'm not sure anybody else, any of our listeners necessarily have. So
yeah, so some of our rotation work, it's in the early stages, right? But essentially, what we're looking at is growing different crops at different phases in the crop rotation, right? And how the rotation or the options as far as herbicide rotation that come along with crop rotation, right? So essentially, we're taking a layering approach, where we're layering pre-emergence residual herbicides with the remaining post-emergence herbicides for Kosha management, and the results from that are I think we'll see more clearly down the road. It's probably too early to tell at this point, but what some of our work is suggesting is that there are some ways to optimize crop rotations from a weed management perspective when it comes to managing herbicide-resistant weeds like Kosha.
Oh, that's very interesting. I know we're part of a bigger study looking at crop rotation, and it's just interesting to see how big of an effect rotation has on just yield in general. So it's interesting to kind of take an extra add an extra layer and look at something like managing herbicide-resistant weeds on using those rotational tools.
Of course, yeah. And so on top of so crop rotation and seeding rates, these are all examples of cultural weed management, right? So,
Yeah, that's right.
So another category of weed management would be mechanical, right? Or physical weed management. So I mean, one of the most popular or one of the often thought of tools would be tillage, obviously, right? Which was kind of one of the predominant practices before we sort of entered this area of herbicide management, right?
Yeah, and that was probably largely eliminated with the push towards no-till.
Of course,
farming,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So we all know that there are negative consequences that come along with tillage, right? But in addition, I think using some of these tools for patch management, right? So weeds, they're inherently patchy, right? There's areas of the field that are much more dense than others, right? And areas where certain weeds like Kosha thrive the most, right? So those kind of like low-lying saline areas. So I think there is opportunity to use some mechanical or physical weed management in those areas, whether it's tillage or mowing or some other form of physical disturbance, or even, say, harvest weed seed control.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and actually I think that kind of brings me to maybe the next topic or area of things to think about. One funny thing you kind of got me thinking of is just, we're maybe focused on the herbicide resistance, but even mechanical. Have you heard of weeds developing like mechanical resistance or anything like that, or certain adaptations for that?
Yeah, certainly. There are definitely examples out there of weeds adapting to selection pressure imposed by mechanical weed management, right? So, some recent evidence from Australia indicating that harvest weed seed control, so using tools like the seed destructor, for example, right?
Yeah.
Basically managing weed seeds at harvest, right? It can actually, if used repeatedly over time, can select for weeds that are shorter in stature and not captured by the combine, right?
Yeah. That makes
so
sense.
that's just one example. Another example being, it may not be necessarily resistance, but more tolerance would be weed species that reproduce vegetatively, something like Canada Thistle, where tillage, right? So tillage can break up root fragments and drag them around the field and basically expand patches of Canada Thistle because you're dragging those roots to new areas, right?
Oh, so it just gets more and more complicated the further in we get. Let's go back to what we were talking about with the patch management, because I think that's pretty interesting, and I know that jointly we're working on a project to manage those sort of things. You've consulted with us quite a bit on the best maybe approach to managing patches. What are some of the methods you think that are going to work the best for that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I think patch management, it is going to be more and more valuable, I think, moving forward, right? Because when we start to use up some of our best options for managing these weeds when it comes to herbicide resistance, right? I think patch management is a way that we can use maybe some of our older or newer technologies, but maybe some of those ones that weren't necessarily sustainable at the field scale, right? So, like we were talking about tillage, right? For example, tilling small patches might be a viable option, right? Where you can still have those benefits of zero tillage on the largest part of the field, right? But those smaller patches you may benefit from using tillage for weed management, right? Other examples being coming back to the cost of herbicides, right? So we always advocate using multiple effective herbicide modes of action, right? But obviously, using multiple herbicides comes with additional cost, right? So the cost of purchasing those chemicals and applying them to an entire field versus the cost of purchasing, say, another mode of action and applying it to a dense patch, right?
Yeah.
So I think this is where some of the technologies regarding mapping, right, of weed patches, for example, and where to apply these additional tools or technologies in an efficient way.
Yeah, that's really what the project that we're doing right now is about. We've got 360 acre fields that have been mapped with the Veris EM38 satellite topography, drones imagery, things like that. And in the office the other day, Trevor was going through and basically training the software to recognize those patches of Kosha, and so kind of zooming in on really detailed images of the field and trying to get it to recognize, and hopefully we can build a prescription from that. And then, like you said, come up with one of those strategies to manage the Kosha, and then monitor it for a couple of years and see which are the viable options. And
yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really good opportunity to try and utilize additional tools for weed management, but also try and save farmers the cost of applying expensive tools to a large area of the field.
Yeah, it's really a win-win when you think about it that way. I mean, you're more than likely a farmer might end up spending less money, get better product, and get even better control and bang for their buck out in the field. So really kind of win-win in the end. So is there anything else that you're working on in terms of research and weed management that we haven't covered yet?
Right, yeah. So, I mean, we work on a wide range of things. So we did cover some of the Kosha work. Another interesting experiment that we're working on for Kosha is looking at cutting Kosha at different times, right? So it all gets back to the biology of the plant, and actually the fact that we don't even know at what time in the growing season Kosha produces viable seed, right? So a lot of times, I mean, Kosha is the first weed to emerge in the spring, but it's also one of the last ones to emerge or to mature in the fall, right? So growers, when they go in to harvest their field, they're having to deal with these green lush patches of Kosha, right?
Yeah.
And often what they do, or what they have to do, is harvest around these patches, because you obviously don't want that green material going through your combine, right? And Kosha is actually it's a fairly viable feed for animals, right? So a lot of publications refer to Kosha as poor man's alfalfa.
I like that.
But yeah, so the issue though being that if growers are cutting these Kosha patches and using them as feed or selling this feed off farm, they could potentially be transferring herbicide resistance traits along with that, right?
Okay, so there are actually producers using it as feed.
Oh yeah,
okay.
For sure. And some of our work that we've added onto this experiment is actually looking at the feed value of Kosha at different times throughout the growing season, but also trying to correlate that with when the seed becomes viable. So is there an optimal time to come in and say cut a Kosha patch that will work well as an animal feed and still not have viable seed?
Oh, that would be really interesting to see. It all goes back to that definition of what makes a plant a weed that you gave us in the beginning.
Yeah, it's kind of like taking lemons and making lemonade, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and when I think about it, there's a lot of grassland and pasture management type work that gets done, and I see what they're growing and doing out there, and my brain instantly goes weed because I'm so used to the cropping systems, right? But like you said, a lot of those so-called weeds make really good feed for animals. So. Yeah,
exactly. And so some of our other work is focusing on taking more of a preventative approach as well. So we have a fairly large project across Western Canada that's focusing on soybean production as well, and looking at ways that we can optimize sort of an agronomic package for soybean to make the crop more competitive with weeds, right? So when we looking at the United States, we see several weed species, very problematic weed species that are resistant to glyphosate, and many of them were selected for in soybean cropping systems.
Yeah, the corn, soybean, Roundup Ready system, they kind of go hand in hand almost from that whole movement of that cropping system, corn, soybean, corn,
exactly.
soybean.
So for soybean, we're looking at trying to optimize planting dates, as well as looking at row spacing, seeding rates, the variability among cultivars as well, like looking at soybean has an enormous range of phenotypes, right? So looking at like a slender variety that's not very branching versus something that's very aggressively branching, right? And as well as integrating things like looking at the effect of the preceding crop, right, as well as cover crops. And the interesting thing with soybean that we're trying to use cover crops and preceding crop stubble to drive down the available plant nitrogen in the system going into the soybean phase of a crop rotation, because soybean nodulate and can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, right? So if we can drive down nitrogen going into soybean, that nitrogen is ultimately available to the weeds in that system, right? So we're trying to decrease the ability for those weeds to compete with soybean.
Right. You're doing what you can to make it tougher for the weeds, easier for the crops. One thing that comes to mind whenever we think about kind of those agronomic factors, or one thing that I think of in my head is by doing all this, do we sometimes make our crops more wimpy and make our weeds stronger? Do you know what I mean by that? Is that something you hear about, or is a concern?
I think over time, a lot of breeding efforts they ultimately focus on crop yield, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, for the most part, they focus on getting a high yielding crop in a weed-free environment, right? And they don't necessarily focus on traits that would make that crop more competitive against weeds, right? There are examples in other areas of the world where they've actually focused on integrating crop or competitive traits into crops, right? So things like leaf area, for example, that would help the crop close the canopy quicker and help compete with weeds, right? To try and also integrate crop competition in there as sort of a method to try and help mitigate the selection pressure for resistance.
Well, that's very cool. I had heard that maybe there was some breeding efforts in that realm for those very reasons. Just there's a potential cap on how much yield you can breed into a particular plant, but at a certain point there's a lot of other factors that you could breed in that make them a lot more robust.
Yes, I mean certainly, like even when a grower is looking at basically which variety to seed this year, right? They have ratings on, they have the yield, right? Then they also have ratings on disease resistance, right? But there's really nothing telling them how competitive that variety is compared to another one. And we do know that variety, or that variability among these cultivars or varieties does exist as far as weed competitiveness. It's just something that is undercharacterized.
Okay, well, maybe I want to wrap up with this and just get into maybe a picture of how we're doing, like overall, if you were to say, how are we doing here in Western Canada? And if you had some advice for growers, producers out there, what are the things that you're maybe seeing that we should improve on? And what are some of those strategies that, we've talked a lot about different ones, but what would be kind of your quick tips on, just don't forget to do this, or whatever it is?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's things that we're doing right, and there's things that we could improve on, right? So let's start off with the positive.
All right.
So, so basically, I mentioned that we do have, I guess we're in third place as far as unique herbicide-resistant weed biotypes. We do have a lower number of resistant biotypes because basically we still have a fairly diversified cropping system compared to other areas of the world, right? Again, with reference to many areas of the United States focusing on corn, soybean crop rotation, right? Whereas we have a good integration of cereals, oilseeds, and pulses in our crop rotation, right? And so one of the things that we need to do is try and maintain that diversity for sure within our crop rotation, because that we're definitely getting that right. So as far as things to improve upon, I mean, in general, we know that, I mean, herbicides are a quick and easy method for weed management, right? And they're something that we want to try and maintain their efficacy into the future, right? And the main way to maintain their efficacy is to basically, I mean, the main way is to not use the herbicide as much, right? But also integrating in non-chemical weed management. That's the area where we need to improve upon. So obviously, as we covered, there's an abundance of ways that non-chemical weed management can be integrated into a crop rotation, right? But I think focusing on areas where we can add it in at sort of minimal cost to a farmer, like we were talking about, like patch management, for example, using some of the new technologies as far as mapping out a weed patch, right, and actually adjusting your management practices based on how that weed exists in the field.
Well, that's great. I know one thing that I struggle with personally, because I do a lot of the herbicide selection and planning out on our research farm, is that, you know, sometimes I just get lazy, and I've used something in the past and it works good, and so I order the same thing again, not, you know, putting the effort in to say, hey, I better make sure that I'm rotating a herbicide group or whatever it is.
For sure. So that kind of that brings me to one point that I think we should cover. So I certainly don't blame anybody for going back to a herbicide again and again that has been effective for them in the past, right? Because and I think that that's obviously not a sustainable approach when it comes to using herbicides, right, and maintaining their efficacy into the future. But I think that one area where farmers could benefit is knowing the profile of resistance, or the type of resistance that they have on their farm, right? So across the prairies, there's several labs that offer sort of fee-for-service diagnostic testing for herbicide resistance, right? And basically, by sending in samples to these labs, growers can figure out, is this weed population resistant to this herbicide, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a valuable tool when it comes to knowing which herbicides will be effective, right? And that may help growers sort of get out of the rut of going back to that same herbicide over and over again.
So you're just leading me into kind of my closing comment for you, is that there are some tools out there, and there's a program ongoing for people who think they may have herbicide resistance in their field to get things tested. And can you explain a little bit about what that is and how they can submit a sample?
Of course, yeah. So we were touching on the diagnostic labs. So those labs, they offer mainly testing for known resistant biotypes, right? So things that we know exist on the prairies and are fairly common. So outside of that, when we start getting into the realm of something that is new or novel on the prairies, right? So this is sort of where our lab can come in and help. So what we do is we offer essentially free testing for growers for types of resistance that we do not know to exist in that area, right? So if a grower suspects that they have resistance to a certain type of herbicide or a certain mode of action that's uncharacterized, they can contact myself and submit a sample, and we'll do testing for free. And essentially what that is it's trying to get at sort of an early mechanism to diagnose types of resistance at a point where they can be managed before they become a very large problem, right?
All right. And how do they contact you?
So yeah, they can. The best way would be to send me an email, right? So
Okay.
I mean, you can look up my name online
On the
obviously,
Google.
on Google, or just email me. It's charles.geddes, Geddes @canada.ca.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Charles.
My
And thanks
pleasure.
very much to the CAP program as well as the Lethbridge College for partnering with us here. And we're going to have more from Dr. Geddes. I'm quite positive that we'll see some of the results and some of the things from the studies he was talking about later on in the summer. So please join us for our plot hops or our field day coming in the spring and summer of 2020. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for listening. This has been Mike Gretzinger, the research coordinator for Farming Smarter. Please subscribe to the podcast. You can listen to this on SoundCloud. You can find us at farmingsmarter.com.